So, you've been living here you're in your 35th year?
Yes, I'm my 35th year of incarceration.
Right.
I've been here. It's my 33rd year here.
So, is this home to you?
It's a complicated question because in some ways I feel that you have to make wherever you are home. Because if I don't land here, if I don't do this is the place where I'm going to live my life. And I think that's true even for short-termers that I work with, but it's certainly true for any long-termer.
Yeah.
You know, once you have a long sentence, the choice has to become, am I living or am I dying? Am I refusing to live because it's here and therefore doing nothing to try to better my life or address anything?
But you always live with a hope that you're going to get out, right?
Absolutely. And in that sense, home is where my daughter is.
Yeah.
You know, home is wherever she lives. Home is with my friends who have been a part of my extended family for all these years, and my family. And there's always, the yearning to go home.
Yeah.
So it's a two-way question. You know,
It's sometimes because Harriet always said she had, in a way, didn't she? That's your daughter.
Yes.
She has two homes.
Yes, she used to say when she was a kid, she would visit here. And I remember one time she visited, and she must have been, I don't know, like 8 years old, and they had just gotten a new vending machine that had something in it that she loved. And she said, "Mommy, look what they got. You know, since the last time I can buy this." And she said, "It's like going to my second home and finding it redecorated." And I think the children's center, that playroom, was her home.
Yeah, that's a home.
And on the other hand, for her too, there's an enormous yearning to, 35 years later, she still comes. She lives in California, and she's amazing. She makes sure to visit me. We go on trailers, but I know that wears on her too.
Yeah, I'm sure. So you have friends? I mean, you really build a sense of community here.
Yes.
Yeah.
Right. Though it's interesting because I oftentimes say I'm on my fourth or fifth generation of long-termers. There were the women who were here doing. When I came in 1983, if you had 15 to life, that was considered a very long sentence. And now, people feel lucky when they have 15 to life because the sentence structure has changed so much. But so that there were the people who were here before me as long-termers who became my friends, and then there were the people who came in at the same time, and most of them are gone. And then there are the people who came in the 90s for whom I was kind of their mentor and who became friends.
So you're the old lady who knows everything, right?
I'm actually, by many of the young women in here, I'm called elder.
Oh yeah. It must be hard when they leave.
I think it's both. I mean, there's both. I think I can identify with them, and I'm watching them do something I want to do. And in that sense, I feel like they're walking the steps that I
would like
dream
to
of.
Yeah.
And I'm glad that someone's walking those steps.
I've always been impressed because there's a sense almost, it's a sisterhood. You're really glad somebody gets out.
Oh, the joy in here when people with long time get out is enormous. And I think, I'm not sure it's as strong. I don't think that the community doesn't quite have the same strength that it did in the old years. But I think that the excitement when someone who's done long time gets out is enormous. It's the same way as when someone who's struggled for 15 years to get their GED, walks across the graduation. I mean, we go crazy. And because...
It's such a sense of accomplishment.
Yes, it's such a sense of accomplishment.
So what do you do during the day here? I mean, it's a long...
So I'm busy. People always think, oh, you're in prison, you must be sitting there. But I am lucky to be in a prison where you can work and have a real life in a certain sense of building meaningful work for myself. And for me, that's two major things, is that I work in the children's center. I work on the nursery, which is actually right across from where we're sitting. And the nursery is a unique program that has actually been here for longer than I've been here. Since 1901. But it's a living unit for women. If you come here pregnant and you're accepted, you apply and you're accepted, you can live with your child until the child is a year old or 18 months. And most of the women on the nursery are short-termers, so most of them actually will be living with their children. So I'm up there as a nursery aide, and primarily I'm a mentor and I'm a facilitator. I also facilitate other parenting classes that go on
So you
in here.
really teach parenting? Or help?
What I do, I think, is
develop.
that what I've learned is that what stops someone from being a parent is less about skills and more about who we are in our lives. So I work with a social worker, civilian social worker, and we do groups where we have a structure, but a lot of it is facilitating women to begin to examine themselves, the choices they've made, their lives, and what it means for them to be responsible to their children, as well as to those who are helping to raise their children.
So does it keep them when they get out of here? Do you see the results that they don't come back?
The nursery is complicated because it's young women. They're at the beginning of whatever crisis they have in their lives. And I think it was 15, now everyone's talking about the fact that there is a new heroin epidemic in upstate New York. But I knew it because 15 years ago I started seeing all these young women from upstate doing time for heroin. And I'm like, heroin? What's going on? And addiction is intractable and creates a whole culture that means that unless those problems are addressed, I think for a lot of the women, the experience on the nursery is life transforming, and that they get to be separated from those forces that have been injurious to them. And sometimes that's drugs, sometimes that's abusive relationships, sometimes that's their own sort of histories of trauma. A lot of times it's all three. And being able to be in a safe place where they are challenged to do something new and to really do some self-reflection, for many of them makes an enormous difference. And we also work with people to have a re-entry plan that means that when they leave, they don't just go right back to the same situation.
And you also work with dogs.
So that's right. So my job is on the nursery.
Does everybody
and in the
have a
children's
job?
center.
Everyone
has a, there's like different slots that people have to fill. You have to have 2 what are called program modules. So for some people that program module might be that they're in a GED class or they're in a vocational class. For some people that's a job like mine or working in the library or for many people it's being a porter and cleaning somewhere. But everyone has to do something for 2 of those modules. So that's my job, and I'm very lucky to have one that is not like, oh, I'm just going to my job because I have to, but it's something I want to do. And then I have been in a program called Puppies Behind Bars for 15 years, and
It's the same thing, isn't it? Nurturing.
it is. Puppies and
mentoring.
babies is
Yes,
how I do my
right.
time. So Puppies Behind Bars was a program that got started actually in 1997. And originally the idea of it was that working dogs, at that time they were guide dogs, when they were puppies, young puppies, they needed to be taken care of and given obedience and socialization. And what better place to do it than a place like here, because we had the time and the focus. Now we actually raise those dogs to be service dogs for wounded veterans.
Oh, that's great.
Which is really great. So I just actually got a
It
new
makes people
puppy.
really feel that they're doing something that's really...
It's one of the programs in here that
Connections,
allows
connection.
people to feel, allows
Yeah.
me to feel
Yeah.
that we're giving back, and I think that's
now,
important.
in between all of this, you went to school?
When I came here, I had been thrown out of school, college, like 15 years earlier, in
At the University of
1969,
Chicago?
and at the University of Chicago. When I came here, there
Because
was
what? You were demonstrating?
because I was in a 2-week-long sit-in
A
and
sit-in,
was hard-headed and didn't fight to try to get the right to go back to school. I reprised that later on, so it took me a long time to see the light. So when I got here, there was a college program. At that time, college was in most prisons around the country through public grants from TAP and Pell. And so I started going to college. And it was, as it is for the women today that are in college, for me it was one of the more significant paths to begin to think in different ways and imagine myself in different ways. And so I got my bachelor's degree in 1991, and
A lot of applause.
it was, yes, it was great. And then I went on my own, and there's an independent graduate program that Vermont College used to have. They still have it, but they don't have it available to prisoners anymore. And I got my master's degree in psychology, which was great.
And then you became a chaplain, or chaplain.
So years later, so I did that, and sort of things come at different times, you know. I guess it was sometime about, I don't know, about 2003, there was the Protestant reverend that was here at the time, Reverend Lopez, started a program that's called CPE, which stands for Clinical Pastoral Education. And it is basically what people do to train and get certified as chaplains. And she always says, you know, chaplains who do that training from the outside come to prison to practice their craft. But she was interested in developing indigenous resources, which meant let's look at the people here who are actually less religious leaders and more women who are seen as elders and mentors, and let's bring that training to us. And it was an amazing experience because when you're a chaplain, that training is mostly about listening and trying to listen to not, I'm like many of us, I always have good advice, but sometimes the most important thing is not to give people advice, it's to allow someone to discover their own voice inside, their own inner voice. And if I had to think about, you know, if I think about the bad choices I've made or the terrible things I've done, at some point there was an inner voice I shut off and didn't listen to, and I think that's true for a lot of the women I work with. And the chaplaincy work is about opening up a communication of listening that allows people to hear their own inner voice.
So that was, I mean, and you were able to do that in a way because you had already done it yourself. So how did you get into this mess?
This mess.
I should say that I knew your mother and father.
Yes.
And some of their very best friends were our neighbors.
Yes.
So it was, I mean, like part of my world, right?
Yes. Yes.
And then
I know that you knew them when they were so devastated by what I had done. Absolutely.
And then when I started working for the governor, Cuomo, the older Governor Cuomo, and I was up here, and I met you.
Right.
You were sitting on a bench watching television with some other women, and you weren't talking to anybody.
Right.
And we've since figured out it was when you first got here.
That's
so
amazing.
how did you get here?
So I had been a radical through the 60s. As I said before, I mean, I started. My parents, as you know, had been in communists and kind of vehement in their own activism and sense of change, especially my father. And then, just as vehemently, he realized that he was wrong, and he left the Communist Party in 1956. My mother left in 1953. We actually spent my first 3 years in the Soviet Union.
So you told a wonderful story somewhere. I think you can see it on the internet. We'll give you a site about how when you came here, they said you had a speech impediment.
Yes,
because you spoke Russian first.
Because I learned Russian. My mother would say I learned both Russian and English at the same time, and she was always amazed that I knew where to speak. But when I came back in 1953, there was an absolute sense like, don't tell anyone and never speak it again. So I shut it down, but I was left with a speech impediment. I couldn't pronounce my R's because in Russian, you roll it. And years later, when I was in school, in elementary school, I had to go to a speech therapist. And it's funny because I was a very quiet, my brother, who's 2 years older, was a kind of boisterous kid and challenged my parents, and I was extremely quiet, which my mother would say later on, we should have encouraged her early, maybe it would have. And I think in some ways I was very internal. I didn't really share what I was thinking and feeling. I was observing, and it seemed like the world was very important, and the only way to be important was to be in that world. And when my parents left the party, their lives were in many ways enormously devastated. And my father will say that he, tried to explain it to us. We were children, and
Couldn't understand.
I certainly didn't understand. But I always felt like something was missing, that there had been a sense of hope and community that got lost. And I think I got it in my head that I was the one that was going to retrieve it.
And that's interesting, because they really became very middle class.
Yes,
very
they
ordinary.
did. And my father remained, very active in Reform Democratic Party politics. But my mother said, "I am taking this family into the American mainstream."
Yeah.
And she was very successful at her career. And she wanted me to be the kind of kid I was not. She wanted me to wear pink. She wanted me to be a cheerleader. And I was like, every way in which we fought it out was sort of my saying. I wore black. I was a beatnik. I identified with the beginning of that counterculture. And from the time I was 14, and when I was 14, I was in junior high school. I joined the citywide school boycotts that were being held at that point, that were led by the black community in Brooklyn, where we lived. And my mother had to look with dismay at, what is my daughter doing? She's making the same mistakes that I made. I think that...
Did you go to Stuyvesant High School?
No, I went to Midwood.
Midwood.
I went to Midwood High School. And I think that a lot of my activism was part of the times and was completely healthy. But I think that I was motivated. I had personal issues behind it that I didn't examine. It was all about, is this right or is this wrong? And so I sort of had to prove that, unlike them, I was never going to give up. And it meant that I never allowed myself to learn from my experience. So by college...
So you got expelled from school.
Exactly.
It didn't affect you.
It's like,
It was a badge
we're
of
right,
honor,
they're
right?
wrong.
It was a
We're
badge of
right.
honor.
So I think that I became more and more extreme. And when I was thrown out of school, I joined SDS at a time when they were shifting into what was called weathermen at the time, and we were doing more. We said, we have to become more militant, and everyone else is just part of bourgeois America. We're going to be the cadre of the revolution, and it created a very internalized small group of people so that I was in there looking to my leadership and leading other people and not caring about who thought anything other than that. I wasn't looking outside myself.
You all lived together?
In those years, we lived together. I lived in a commune in Chicago, and I became more and more sort of vehement that the only thing that was, I think I identified with violence, which was the one thing that, however my parents were radical, they never believed in violence. My father was an intellectual, and I think that it was my rebellion against him that sort of said, to really be genuine, I have to...
There's a quote or something that said something about, you really believed that you were changing the world, changing the system,
yes.
And that violence was
the way to do it,
and it was an accepted way.
Right, and you could say, in the
the
world...
only way.
Outside of us.
Look at us now. We're going right through the same thing.
Yes, it's
right.
And I think, you could say there were liberation wars that were significant and were involved with violence. But my sense of sort of saying, okay, if it's true out there, then it's true for us, was without any real critical lens. It had to do with, I have to show that I am as tough as everyone else. It's very strange, oftentimes when I'm with women that I work with in here who say we're in gangs, and I say, well, were you scared? And they would say, I don't let myself be scared. And it's exactly what I did. I was a little girl from Brooklyn who was scared and refused to respect my fear.
Instead, you worry about your peer pressure?
I worried about looking and appearing
to your
be
fellow
absolutely,
patriot.
Absolutely. But I also believed in it. I believed in myself, and I went through the period of the repression against the black movement. I knew Fred Hampton, who was killed in Chicago. So a lot of what was coming to me around like there is a crisis, and the more at a time of the Vietnam War, we had thousands, and then many people went and sort of rejoined their own lives and figured out what to do. And I'm saying, everyone's willing to leave. I have to show I'm going to be part of that small select group that isn't going to leave. And also the idea that I have to show that even if the conditions of my life would allow me to buy back into society, that I have to join with those that don't have that. So it created in me a very, very closed circuit, a totally closed circuit.
But still you wanted to have a baby.
So at the same time, and I would say about this, yes, I did want to have a baby. I was a lesbian. I had to really think about and decide that I wanted to have a child. I had helped raise a lot of children. I lived with women with children.
Because there was a commune, so everybody
That's
had.
right.
So living in a commune,
right.
you saw the babies
Right.
and families.
And I was helping to raise kids, but I think that the desire to have a baby was very personal. And I think that I psychologically segregated my personal desires from my political positions. And in a way, I sort of said, if I'm going to have a baby, I felt guilty about that personal desire. And after I had Harriet, I had Harriet in a communal situation with people who, like me, were running around making the revolution. And immediately people were saying, "Oh, Judy, you better, we still need you. You don't think you can go off and, don't become just involved with your own child. Your child is no less important than the children of the world." And so, in a way, this relationship that was so important to me and that I was so invested in, I felt illegitimate about. It felt like I was compromising my politics to do that. And I had a desire to stop doing what I was doing, but I felt guilty about that. And I certainly felt guilty about, for once, I did know that I didn't want to do anything risky, and yet I felt guilty about it. I couldn't allow myself to believe that as a legitimate feeling. And it's what meant that when someone said to me, where there's, the people who are black fugitives who are trying to continue to survive and elude the police and wage the black revolution, and they do it by raising money, by robbing banks and armored cars, and they need white drivers, and then, will you do it? And I said yes, and I said yes because I felt like, I have to show that even though I have this child, I'm not going to become one more, white privileged mother. I'm going to show that I still, if I believe this, if that's my rhetoric to believe in violence, then I have to show that I'm willing to practice my rhetoric. And it's such a, I look back at that way of thinking, and it has nothing to do with what's right, what's wrong. It has nothing to do with looking at something outside of my own group and my own group's thinking. I never stopped and said, "Oh, who's driving that car? Who's driving that armored car? What's it going to be like for them?
Yeah.
Who's going to be in that mall?" I think
It was
that
just
way
a
of
mission.
thinking. It was a mission, and I was single-minded, absolutely single-minded.
So you left Harriet that morning?
So that morning, and it was a mission that I thought was going to just, I thought I was going to drive there, drive back, and it would be over. That's basically, these people know what they're doing. I'm going to just drive there. I'm going to, I'm in a car alone. I'm scared. I'm not even a good driver. I knew if I have to follow the car in front of me because I'm going to get lost. And all I'm thinking about is I don't know what I'm doing, so I have to just try to do it. It wasn't so little about even what it was that I believed in or anything. It was really just I have to show that I can do this and that I won't fail these people, because if I can do this, then they might believe me that I really am committed, and I can sort of take a break and continue to do public radical work, which was most of what I was doing. But I don't have to put myself at risk like this. I also sort of have bought a little space for me. you know.
So we landed up in Nyack.
So instead, there we are. We're in Nyack, and I'm in a car. I'm in a car quite a ways away from the actual robbery, but it's overlooking it. And I can't even remember anymore if I heard gunshots or not. But my job was to sit and wait and see another car, see a van driving away, and then to follow that van. And so when I saw that van speeding along, I followed them. I was completely at that point. I was in a state of mind that I can remember whenever I used to do some things that were scary, I would kind of dissociate myself from it. And it was almost like all unreal. And I was in no state to think about, you know, what am I doing? I just was there to show that I could be there.
And you could have turned around and gone in a different direction.
Exactly. Not once, but twice. You know, because then we're you know, there's a switch up, and then we're driving along, and there's a police barrier, and the van that I'm not in pulls up at the barrier, and I just go along a side road. And at that moment, I didn't know what was going on exactly, but I knew something bad was going on. And any sane person, forget about saying this is wrong, I shouldn't be doing this, just sane on the level of realizing I'm in trouble and let me get out of here, would have just kept driving. And I didn't. I said, the one thing I know I can do is I can be, you know, I can't abandon people. I have to be here. And then that time, you know, there was a shootout there, and 2 policemen were killed in that shootout. And 2 people ran and jumped into the car I was in, and we start driving, and I have no idea where I'm driving. And pretty soon I'm being chased by a police car. And I'm a terrible driver. And I'm driving along, and the last thing I'm going to be able to do is to, you know, be in a car chase. And at that point, I have a shoulder that comes out of joint. My shoulder was wrenched out of joint because I was so tense, and I crash into a retaining wall. And I have a poem that I wrote where I sort of describe that moment, and I sort of say, you know, there's, as much as I was trying to do what I was supposed to do, I was also like, stop me, you know, something has to stop me. And there was both terror and relief about it being over when it was over. You know, one of the things that I look back on and think about that day was that the policemen who arrested me and who took me into the station, the look of horror on their faces was, you know, devastating. And I can think back and see it now, but I know I didn't allow myself to see it then.
You got angry.
I just was like, I have to show I'm strong. I knew I had just been a lousy getaway driver, but I had to show that I could be a good captured freedom fighter. You know, I had done work supporting political prisoners for years, other political prisoners, and I was like, okay, this I know what to do. I didn't know how to drive that car, but I sure know how to do this. And that bravado, I don't want to say I didn't believe my rhetoric. I did. I believed in it. I was angry about the injustice in this country, but the bravado came from that sense of having to show myself to be someone I really wasn't. And I think, you know, you started out with a question about, you know, is this home? I think you have to land here to realize I'm here. Who am I that landed here? Who am I that allowed myself to do something that led to 3 people being killed? Who am I to someone who didn't even allow myself to be worried about that or feel any feelings about it beforehand?
But you landed up here for 75 years, so you continued the bravado
exactly
for a while.
For the whole 2 years of my pre-trial period.
Yeah.
I maintained, I said, you know, we have to show that we're not just common criminals, that we're political prisoners, and, you know, that we have a right to wage revolution. And we have to support the Black liberation struggle.
So you did that in the courtroom. You didn't have a lawyer, you didn't like the system, you stayed in the basement, and you got 75 years. 3 25-year
sentences running back
Somebody
to back.
else, your other companion, she pled guilty and she got 25 years.
She got 20 years, 20 to
years,
life.
20 years.
Yes.
So she's been out
Yes.
for 10, 12 years.
Yes. And also a lot of the...
I was going to say the other people.
Right. So the day that, the day of the arrest, the day of the crime, 4 of us were arrested, and another person who was arrested a couple of days after that, were
Tried by the
were
state.
tried by the state. And then the people who were fugitives for any length of time were tried by the feds in a RICO case.
So they were charged with conspiracy, not murder.
They actually were charged with conspiracy and murder. So, they were charged with the RICO allows the federal government to kind of wrap the specific cases in a larger conspiracy case. And so when they were arrested in the years after that, everyone else was charged and tried by the feds.
And sentenced to lower.
A number of the first people who were charged, because most of the evidence in the federal case was by fairly unreliable snitches, were not found guilty of the most serious charges. And then eventually 2 people were found guilty, one of whom was a getaway driver like I was, and the other one was basically considered or portrayed as the mastermind.
And he's getting out of prison.
And he's getting out of prison because federal time is different than state time. Yes.
So they're just a couple like you, but
There's only 2 of us left.
2 of us.
And both of us were in the state, and both of us were getaway drivers. Yes.
Something.
It is something.
Yeah. So you got the 75-year sentence, and they sent you here?
Right. The day I was sentenced, I was sent here.
And you were quite,
I was still completely, I think the person that you saw that day
I think I
was
saw you shortly after you
very
arrived
shut
here.
down.
Yeah.
And probably the only, very freaked out about Harriet. But
Had you seen her in the 2 years pre-trial?
I did see her in the 2 years pre-trial, and I saw her pretty soon after I got here. I was kept in isolation when I was first here. In a way,
It was in a different world,
I was,
right?
Most people who arrive here for a long time, it takes us a long time to land. And some people, that means that they spend their first day, years fighting or getting in trouble. And I didn't get into trouble until I got into big trouble, but I just didn't really accept that this was what happened and why it happened for a long time. And eventually, because I was in communication with fugitives, I ended up in isolation in SHU. And my parents, who were very worried about my daughter.
They were very angry at you.
They were very, very angry. My father was the first person, when I was first arrested, he came to visit me in the county jail, and he screamed at me and screamed and screamed. He said, "This is what you call a black revolution?" I mean, he screamed. And I know I was like, I couldn't even go near his anger. But it stuck with me years later when I was willing to really think about it and realize how right he was. I always, it's something I couldn't handle it then, but years later, I told him before he died how grateful I was that he came, that it was an act of love for him to come and scream at me. It's what I needed. And even though I couldn't let it in then, eventually I let it in.
So for you, the SHU, the segregated housing, isolation, what do they call it now?
Right.
Yeah. That was a blessing in a way.
Well, I would say a number of things happened at the same time. One was my parents took me to court and took custody of Harriet. And I think for the first time it made me realize that it broke me out of the illusion, because the person that mattered most to me was no longer in my political communal situation. And so I was forced to have to sort of step outside of it to begin to have a relationship to her and to rebuild a relationship to my parents. And that was critical. And the other thing is that I was beginning to have a series of conversations with someone who was a sociologist with a psychological bent. Who
This is why you were in the shoot.
Yes,
Yeah.
she came. She actually interviewed me, a series of interviews, and her name's Gilda Zwerman, and she her questions were the first. I mean, it was the first time that I was talking to someone who thought my political ideas were ridiculous, but was interested in my experience. And by her probing my experience, I began to look at my experience. So that also cracked me open. So, and then when I was in, I don't think that she was a blessing. I think that I said, I'm here. I'm going to use the fact that I'm in isolation to stop. I started to realize that I was so invested in what people thought about me that I didn't know who I was or what I thought about things. And that I could use that time to begin to ask myself, who am I and what do I really feel, and how in the world did I leave my 11-month-old baby in her crib and tell her I'd be back and go off and rob a Brinks truck? How did I do that? And I didn't start out asking that question because I realized it was wrong overall. I started out asking that question because it meant that I left my baby. But allowing myself to look at that, like, what did I do about what was the most important relationship in my life, got me to the place where I could begin to say, who are these people that were killed? And they have families too. And, you know, when you're in SHU, a lot of who you relate to are officers, you know, and you're dependent on officers. And those officers were not so different from the officers who were killed that day. And all of a sudden, these general statements, these abstract ideas, didn't hold water anymore.
Did you have long conversations with them, the officer?
I had a lot of conversations. It wasn't really about, it certainly wasn't about my crime, but it was about what was the day-to-day life in there. SHU at that time was filled with mentally ill women. If you were mentally ill, drugged out, and quiet, you were considered mentally ill. If you were mentally ill and obstreperous, you were considered a behavior problem. And it had women who were, you know, who literally ate their mattresses, you know, women who were trying to hang themselves every night, women who were setting fires, and there had been a class action suit filed about the use of SHU for mentally ill women, and it had been filed but never really pursued. And I contacted, I was in contact with some of the lawyers that had done that case, and I said, I want to revive the case. And it was interesting because here I am, revolution, but for the first time I'm looking at a problem and saying, this is a terrible problem, let's be practical about what to do about it. And I remember, so I began to be much more concrete in my awareness of where I was and what made sense.
What's SHU physically like? You have your own room? Is it a cell?
It's a cell.
It's bars?
It's got a
wall.
Right. It's a
Metal wall.
metal thing, and it's concrete floors, and there's a metal slab of a that's the bed, and you have a mattress on it, and it's an odd kind of isolation because it's very noisy. There are people screaming all over the place.
So it's not like being a monk in a...
Not at all. But I tried to become a little monk-like in myself. Also, back then, the rules were different. So now I think you only get allowed a visit once a week. I had many visits. My father brought my daughter every week. I was seeing Gilda, you know, every week. So I had time alone, but I also had time with people to talk about some of what I was going through.
Was there still anger between you and your father?
That was the period that we began to talk to each other. When they first took Harriet, I would barely talk to them, and he would bring her every week. And And it was sort of like, well, for the sake of the child, we'll act like we're friendly. But over time, what started out as sort of acting like it became real. And I had been very close to my father when I was young, and his relationship to my daughter reminded me so much of the father who I had loved, and who, and he had, you know, my father's heart was broken by my crime, and his taking care of his granddaughter kind of rekindled his heart, and in a very gentle way. And if you remember my father, he wasn't always such a gentle guy. He was as argumentative as I was, but in those last years, I think he gentled, and I think his quality helped me to gentle.
So what did you decide when you came out? I mean, as you came.
So by the time I came out of SHU, and 2 years later, I had stopped calling myself a political prisoner. That was the first thing. I'm like, I am, you know, a political prisoner implies either that you are innocent, I was not innocent, or that you justify the crime. And by then, I did not justify the crime. I recognized that 3 good men with families were killed for no good reason. There was nothing to reclaim it. And I didn't know what else I knew, but I knew that. So I stopped calling myself a political prisoner. And I had sort of decided that I wasn't even going to rethink my politics. I was trying to rebuild myself on much more personal terms. And I had stopped sort of being a public political person. I said, don't visit me unless you're a friend. You know, don't come because you want to talk about the movement. I'm not interested right now. I'm not saying some of these things I don't believe in. I'm saying I have to rebuild myself as an individual. I don't even know who I am as an individual. And when I came out of SHU, it was the very beginning of the AIDS crisis. And we were interested in beginning to do work about AIDS in here.
You guys really did a protocol that's used all over the country.
Yes.
It's AIDS education for the women.
Yeah, it took some years to do that, but because I was a year, I was sent away into the federal system for a year. I came back, but when I came back, we had made this. You know, this prison for 20 years was headed by a warden named Elaine Lord. You knew her well. And Lord was a remarkable corrections leader who, one, believed that women are different than men, which they are, and 2, that to manage prisons, you have to recognize that they are communities where everyone who lives in them and works in them has to be invested in the community. It can't just be through brute force that you force people to cooperate. And so she said, if there's problems here, you have to help us solve them. And that was our challenge. And for me, that was the challenge to say, oh, this is not, to work on issues that I felt strongly about in ways that were not about they're the enemy and we're right, but saying, where is our common ground? And that started actually when I was in SHU, about the mentally ill women. You know, the correctional officials knew it was a problem. They recognized, they knew that
she
they were.
always talked about it.
Yes, she knew that prison was not the place for mentally ill women, and certainly SHU wasn't. So, so she said, oh, you know, we went to her and we said, there's stigma, there's fear, there's no information. We want to take on the problems of the AIDS epidemic in here. And she said, okay, you know, I have to trust you, you know. So we said, well, we're going to let you know, we're going to write it all down, we're going to show you what we're doing, we're going to work with you in it. And so here I was, you know, someone who had shifted to say, let's find the common ground where we work together, and let's realize that it's not us and them, you know. And that, in some ways, became my, my spiritual calling, was to realize that in every situation that appears to be a conflict, there is some common humanity that you have to find and allow it to nurture. Because the choice is between that and devastation. And I knew that I would never, ever, ever allow myself to participate in any way in something that led to other people's devastation.
So can you find with understanding the whole thing? I mean, it's a silly question. Can you forgive yourself?
I think
you understand.
Right. I think that one of the things when I said to myself, I have to figure out who I am, was that I started going to Jewish services, and my parents were very Jewish, but they were secular Jews. They were not religious. And I was not going to Jewish services to find religion, but I was going to sort of say, you know, I tried to join the Black Revolution. I'm not a Black person, you know. Who am I? You know, and some of who I am, it comes out of a history and an identity as a Jew, and that's really where I went. I think once I started going, I found I found a context that helped me think about atonement. You know, in Judaism, there's a recognition that we do wrong, and that the importance to recognize you're wrong and to try to repair the wrong. And in Judaism, we call it teshuvah. Most people call it atonement. And I think for me, it was very helpful because it was concrete. It sort of said, first you have to recognize that you've done wrong. Second, you have to apologize to those that you've harmed. Third, and you have to continue to do so, whether or not they accept that apology. And so part of that, and to me, I had harmed 3 families. You know, the people I had harmed the worst, that I felt responsible for, were no longer alive, but they were left with 9 children who were growing up without their fathers, and 3 widows, and a community of people who had been devastated. Other people had been. So that whole community I started to think of in very personal terms. And ultimately I did publicly apologize.
How do you do that? It's very difficult, isn't it? I mean, you can't, by regulations or law, you can't talk to them.
Right.
So how do you do that?
I wrote a piece, I wrote a letter, and actually it was after 9/11, because I was already, by then, we're talking about I had begun to look at my case, and my parents, while they were alive, were adamant, you have to go back into court, you were a getaway driver and you have more time than anyone else. And I said, well, how can I be sorry for my crime?
And you didn't have any counsel.
Right. And how can I be sorry for my crime but still try to do something for myself? And I realized that part of my recklessness toward others included recklessness toward myself. And so trying to actually address my own legal situation was part of repairing. And but I always felt that I wanted it to be clear to that community that I was going back into court on very different terms than that firebrand who didn't care about their feelings when I went to trial.
That's important.
So, and I wasn't sure what to do about it. And then 9/11 happened, and one of the survivors, the surviving Brinks guard who had been injured during our crime, went back to work, and he was killed in 9/11. Joseph Trombino. And I realized that I had to figure out how to say, how to at least have it out there, whatever people felt about it. So I wrote a letter, and it was printed in the Rockland papers, and in which I tried to say, I would like to, completely dissociate myself from the horror and terror of 9/11, but the truth is, I understand what it's like to be an internalized, true to your own group and nothing else. Your only morality is your group, and that kind of zealotry and where it lands you. And so that was how I tried to apologize.
And what were the letters in response?
I think that they did an article in which they interviewed people, and I think most of the people who were interviewed, many of whom were police, were pretty suspicious of me. There was one who sort of said, well, she has nothing to gain, she's got life anyway, so, I'm glad she's apologizing. But that's not a community that sees their work as having to address my feelings. I would say that, they feel that they've had to address their own wounds. And
they have yearly memorials, don't they?
Yes, they do. Yes, they do. And I think that that the ethos, I think pretty much when any policeman is killed, is to say, there's no reclaiming, there's no reclamation in that situation. But that did not mean that I shouldn't do what I have to do. So that's a critical step. But the other thing that Judaism says is you have to work on yourself so that you change enough that if you were put in the same situation again, you would do something different.
Oh, that's interesting.
And that, to me, when we talk about, in prison, people talk about remorse. And a lot of what remorse really turns into is guilt. But remorse is something else. Remorse is saying, I owe it to those who I have harmed to be better and do better, and to make the changes I can make, and to find ways to repair. If I can't repair, I can't bring back the lives that I lost. But I can certainly, there have been generations of youngsters who have come in here and said, oh, well, you were down with the real thing. And I'm like, nope, I was a knucklehead just like you were. I just had a different rhetoric, and beware when we think that we're so right that we don't have to think about who's at the other end of our anger. I've had a chance to be able to say in this community, under these terms, how do you foment a spirit of cooperation and forgiveness and respect and self-respect? And that's been my way. And do I see myself as someone who's worthy of forgiveness? Sure I do.
We have all these terms, remorse, as you said,
Yes.
rehabilitation.
Right.
What
does it mean?
I mean, well, I guess you're an example of it, no?
I think that I would say a couple of things. One is I am very fortunate to have been in a prison that did put meaning to rehabilitation. And I think both my peers and many of the people who have worked in here would say that you can't, prison doesn't rehabilitate people. People have to rehabilitate themselves.
They have to take the opportunity.
They have to.
They have the
prison,
time.
Exactly. So prison has to create the opportunity for people to reinvent themselves.
Yeah, it gives you the time to really think and do the.
And in this instance, in this program, in this prison, it gives you programs that allow you to do something better with yourself, not just in the sense of like, there's certain therapeutic programs, but you can begin to, most women who do terrible things do it because of histories of trauma, because of terrible relationships they're in, because of addiction. And so what rehabilitation is really about is reinvention, is being able to be the people that maybe they could have been if their lives had been different. Finding a different sense of identity and a different sense of purpose. And I think for many women like me, it's our children. It's like I'm responsible for what my child is going through.
How many women do you think are your age here?
More than I would, there's actually quite a number of gray-haired women walking around. Many of them are not old-timers like me.
Oh, I see.
So people come in I've discovered that women, there's a lot of, there's two aging populations. There's women like me who came in came in younger, and I just was talking to someone who's at the end of 25 years. She has a 25 to life sentence. She's going to go to the board. Mm-hmm. And, she said, I came in here 25 years old. She said, I spent my childbearing age here. I'm leaving a menopausal woman. So I live with a lot of menopausal women. I live with women who have been inside for a really long time.
So mostly they're women, the women who've been in here, we call them long-termers, they've mostly committed violent crimes or been associated with violent crimes.
Absolutely, absolutely. I mean, when I first was here, there were long-termers who were here on drug crimes, but that's no longer true. And a lot of the young women are here for violent crimes. And I know that there's a whole discussion going on out there now about how to reform prisons and reform sentencing for violent and nonviolent.
Well, but they're not talking enough about violent, I think. Most of the stuff is earmarked for nonviolent, right?
I think what's interesting is that when people say nonviolent drug charges, it's a little bit of an oxymoron, because if you speak to the women, I work with women who are here on nonviolent crimes with short time on the nursery, but they will say that when they are in the throes of addiction, they are reckless and they are just lucky that they ended up getting arrested before they did something worse. Or they have experienced worse. They have been both victims of violence and they have perpetrated violence. So I think that, at the same token, a lot of the women who are here on violent crimes, like me, were the accessories to men who were the primary people, but the men knew what they were doing, so they took pleas, and the women said, I had a friend here who drove a car, and her drug dealer boyfriend went up to the drug spot and ended up in a shootout and came down and said drive, and she did, and she had 50 to life, and he knew to take a plea, and she's
still here?
No, she died actually many years ago. And there are also many women who are here who are the children of those addicts who were here for nonviolent drug-related crimes. But their children paid the price, and most of them lived incredibly difficult lives as children. And a lot of them ended up in violent situations because that's how they survived in the street. I do this group that I was talking about, one of the parenting groups that I do with long-termers, and there was a woman who was in my last group, and she said, I was raised in a gang. My parents were identified with the gang. Everyone I knew were identified with a gang. I never questioned fighting. She said, I took my child out of that situation because I want my child to know there's something different than that. And I now know there's something different than that.
Is anybody here with a term as long as yours?
There are some women who are here with life without parole, which wasn't even a sentence when I was first here. And there are, I think, a couple of women with multiple sentences.
And do you think, we talk a lot about how do you get out of here?
I think that I live with the two women who, the three of us have been here the longest. And they've actually been here, if I'm here 33 years, they've been here 36 years. And we're all aging women, who have learned, and we're not just aging, we've also learned
you must have
from
learned
life.
A lot.
We've learned from life. We are not the people we came in as. And
so what are you doing here? That's a good question. What are you doing here? Why are you here?
So I think that that's a question. I think that for many years the idea was just, increase the level of punishment. When I was first here, women who were here for terrible violent crimes did 15 years to life and got out. And by the way, never came back. Never came back.
Well, the recidivism rate for older people is
and for women who have done long time on violent crimes is almost
just,
non-existent. And you throw in that you've gotten a college degree, which doesn't just give you a marketable skill, it gives you an ability to reflect on yourself in society. And so you have a way of being able to understand things that are different. And it's a question that society has to look at. It's the question that I hope our governor has to look at, which is, do we believe in interminable punishment, or do we believe that that we should relook at someone down the road?
Forgiveness.
And if not,
it's not even forgiveness,
it's mercy.
It's mercy.
When I ask for clemency, I'm not asking for
forgiveness.
First of all, the governor can't forgive me.
Right.
I did not kill his father. But he can apply mercy to looking at someone who has taken responsibility, who's tried to live a life that that represents an understanding of what I did and what it means to try to change, and in a sincere way. And that if you believe in, if you believe that that's what prison should be about, then you might want to look at the people who represent success stories for you.
It's certainly what we say prison is about, right?
Right. Well, I think we say many things.
Yeah, about what prison is about. I mean, there are certain people that most likely should be incarcerated for, I don't want to say forever, but for very long.
When I was first here, I don't know if I think you worked with the Long-Termers Committee. They were trying to come up with a law that said anyone after a certain amount of time should get relooked, that there should be an independent board that relooks at that and says, what were all the mitigating factors at the time, and what does it look like now?
It's a very good suggestion. So maybe some more people should take it up. I was thinking when the couple that did the San Bernardino shooting. And all of these independent terrorist actions, you must understand that, huh? I mean, would you be,
I think
you would be a great advisor on how to stop this in homegrown terrorism.
I don't know if you can stop homegrown terrorism. I certainly know that their mindset, like mine at the time, is totally disconnected from humanity, from anything other than themselves and what they think. And the only thing that shifts that, if it's going to be shiftable, is to allow someone to reconnect. So I can't say, I mean, I think you can say there's a mercilessness to saying, I don't care, I am only my own, I am the universe. And I think that when you're a terrorist, you are like that. When I sort of said, this is my vision of justice and I am going to enact it. And it doesn't matter, I don't think about the consequences because the world is so terrible that change should happen and there's going to be consequences. You know, people are going to die. Your rhetoric becomes a way of not thinking about people as people. And you have to think about people as people. Every step along the way of my crime, or before my crime, or after my crime, all I had to do was look at someone in the face and say, wow, I wonder where they're supposed to be tonight. I wonder where I'm supposed to. All I had to do was look at my child and say, can I really assure her that I'm going to be here tonight? And if I can't, is anything worth that? So I think that I can't say that, how do you stop terrorism? But I do think that you have to treat people in a way. We have to be a society where people are given a sense of worth and self-worth so that they value themselves enough that they can value others. And that's what I do with the women in here, is to say, what matters to you? Care when women get angry and they're about to go and have an argument with an officer and get themselves in trouble and they say, I don't care. I would say those are the most dangerous words you can say because they're the words you say before you do harm to yourself or others. And they're a lie. You do care. That's why you're as angry as you are. I am not trying to take away your anger, but I'm saying recognize the heart that is feeling angry and allow that heart to stay open to everyone else around you, to everything around you. And that's what I would say about homegrown terrorism, is that the more we alienate each other, the more ripe we are for that. People have to, the thing that Miss Lord did is she said, everyone has to buy into the system. Do I hate prison? Yes. But do I have a stake in my life in here? Yes, I do. Does that make me a more manageable prisoner? Yes. Does it also give me the chance to become a better person, social being? Absolutely. That's what we need to be. We all need to be.
So do you still get angry?
Absolutely.
What do you get angry at?
It was funny. This is about a year ago. It's not really funny, but they started building, because of a suit, they can no longer put mentally ill women in SHU, and there's a separate program called TPU that they're in. And it's housed in the Regional Medical Unit, RMU. And they tore down the yard that used to be their small caged-in yard, sort of fenced-in yard, and they built what we call Little Guantanamo. This is this enormous caged structure that has all these very small outdoor areas. You barely feel like you're outside if you're in it. I mean, I've never been in it. And when they were building it, I was furious. And people saying, well, they have to build it because these girls don't know how to get along with each other, so they have to be wrecked separate. And I went berserk. I said, they're in trouble because they don't know how to get along, and we're reinforcing their sense of isolation by keeping them isolated. And I'm going off, and I was with my friends who I live with, and they were like, "Ooh, Judy, there's the old Judy." So, and it was funny because I was talking to right after that, an officer came who I knew from the old days in SHU, who used to be the rec officer, and she said, you know what? When I worked in SHU, I wrecked you guys. I was in that yard with you. I was completely in control of that situation. And I agree that our job includes helping people learn how to get along. And if they're mentally ill, that becomes even more important.
So were you successful in changing the plans?
Oh, no, they built it.
Oh.
They built it, and it's at enormous cost. And you know, and that's, that's a system that's trying to figure out what to do about a sort of a difficult situation. A third of our population is mentally ill, and they are obstreperous. They are difficult to manage, and the society's taken away resources to deal with them, except in prison. What are they supposed to? What are people who are trying to work in prison supposed to do?
Yeah, they're not trained, and it's
a
very disruptive.
ridiculous situation. But so yes, that was a situation where I got angry at. I get angry at injustice. I still care about that, but I don't get angry at people in that sense. If I'm angry at someone, I'm going to talk to that person, and I have great conversations with officers. I have meaningful. I've probably had as deep conversations about my crime with officers as I have with my peers, because I know they're in the same situation I am, and they're facing some of the same problems I am. And we can disagree, but we're not separate species.
It's very interesting. That's a big clue, isn't it, to how the world should be.
Right. And that's for me, that's the radical shift.
Do you follow politics?
I do. Of course I do.
Yeah. It's shocking to you what we've come to?
It's very sad. I find it. And I think it's interesting because in the face of so much insecurity, there's a kind of narcotic in anger and retribution.
Definitely. It's very bad. It's a bad thing.
It doesn't solve anything.
Yeah.
And
in a way, it's going in the opposite direction of what you're suggesting.
It is. But I think both things are happening at once. People are worried about, they're waking up to climate change being a problem. They're waking up to the devastation that's been caused by mass incarceration. And at the same time, they're trying to figure out a rhetoric that doesn't, I think that's where the thing about nonviolent drug crimes comes from. It sort of soothes people into thinking they're solving the problem, but for the deserving people. When anyone who works in corrections knows that there's not two separate groups of people. There's women who, it's not based so much on what you did to get yourself here as who you're going to become while you're here. And so I think that slogans, just like my slogans led me astray, certain slogans become a way of saying, oh, we're solving the problem.
So you do have hope, though,
I do.
someday.
I've always lived with hope. I mean, for one thing, I think you have to live with hope. I have to live with hope in order to be at my best. And some of my hope just comes from the day-to-day. I mean, I have a new puppy, and my puppy, I have hope that I do good enough work with my puppy that she will end up going to a veteran, as my last dog did. And I had the privilege of being able to be part of a team training program where the 6 veterans that were going to get our dogs came in, and we taught them how to do it.
So you meet them.
So we meet them and we train them. And to watch people who have sacrificed and come back deeply wounded from Iraq and Afghanistan and see the changes that just 2 weeks with our dogs makes gives me hope in them, but also gives me hope in myself as being able to do that. But I also, I have hope. I've been asking for clemency for 6 years, and I have hope that that this discussion that's going on about endless sentencing can begin to look at looking at people as individuals. I have hope that if I went from seeing people in categories to seeing people as individuals, that our governor and our criminal justice system can begin to do that. Not just for me, but for others as well.
People. Yeah. Is there there's really very little racial divide here.
Much less than people talk about in men's prisons, and I don't know if it's really true in men's prisons. I think, women are social beings, and it doesn't mean that racism is not an issue that comes up. It comes up all sorts of ways, in complicated ways, and oftentimes it's important to talk about. But there's not groupings based in racial divides in that.
Do we have
way.
people of color who've been here for such a long time?
There's the two women who have been here longer than me are both African American, and Roz was 17 when she was arrested, and Val was 21, and they have 50 to life, and both of them have pretty severe chronic illnesses. And when I fight for clemency, I hope that I'm not the only one, because
one state official, he is no longer a state official, was quoted as saying, and I think that, was it the DA or somebody from NIA? If she's doing such a good job and so many good things, we shouldn't take her out of prison. She should stay there, right? That attitude, that is a merciless attitude.
That's a great way to
I don't want to
say
use
it.
the word forgiveness anymore, because I think you were very good. But we have to have empathy and sympathy and understand. I mean, as a society, that's a very important ingredient, isn't it?
I think a couple of things. One is, I think mercy produces mercy. I mean, when we do violence, our hearts are shut down and we are being merciless. And when we feel, some of what helped me change was people being good to me and caring about me, which allowed me to care about myself. And I see that constantly with the women I work with. The more I care for them, the more they begin to be more responsible. And I think that that's true about something like clemency. It's sort of saying, mercy it's true, I do good work in here. And women here know that. And women will find hope in seeing me walk out the door. They will say, the nursery mothers who are short-termers, when they leave, they say, I feel terrible leaving you behind. There's another woman that works there, Leanne. You and Leanne deserve to be. And I think that for people to be able to say, she did the right thing and in a sincere way, and here's a system willing to look at that, that's something that can engender hope in others. And it's not a race between this person and that person. That spirit would, I think, apply to others as well. I encourage a lot of women.
The other thing that we haven't talked about is your writing, the poetry and writing. That's a very important thing.
I'm laughing because I'm not doing very much of it right now. And people are saying, why aren't you writing more? But for me, the writing has been very important as a way to find a good voice, to find a voice to speak to my experience and my truth, and hope that it can reach other people as well. And
it's something people have come into the prison to help people write.
It's been great.
Is there still a program of writing?
There isn't. At this point, there's not a poetry program, but there's rehabilitation through the arts, which does drama in here, and in the college program we do a poetry workshop. And poetry has been enormously important for so many of us, in a way that we can be ourselves and be creative. And I think that's been really important to us. I think women have a tendency to do it, but not to reach out with our poetry. And I'm always telling people, publish. Let your voices be heard.
So you are very generous in character, right? Believe in getting it out.
Right. Yeah. And believe that part of that isolation that prison represents doesn't, the more that people can break out of it, the more that they can reinvent themselves in positive ways, including what you're saying. I think that the volunteers who have come in here with those programs, they've changed us as human beings by bringing the bigger world inside. I think that's actually a really important part of the programs in prison.
So we've come to really the end of this discussion, and I want to thank you for all the things you've shared with us, but also I hope that we can share it with other people and they can see that we need that sense of what? Of mercy, that we need to have more people out of prison once the purpose of prison has been accomplished. Where now you're almost like you're in a postgraduate school. It's like a, you know, it really is. And so it's an important thing in society. And you've got a daughter out there, even though she's how old now? 30?
She's 35. But in some ways, I feel worse for her now. I mean, you know, she lives in California and she makes this trek and she's wonderful about doing it, but I feel like, you know, she remains in prison as well. And I think, yes, I think it's our families that pay for so much of that. And I think that it's...
Your families are also very punished by
absolutely
the things that happen.
It's really, really hard.
As well.
And I think just, you know, that last thing about, in Judaism, the idea of sort of when you do wrong, you create this rip in the society. And the final step toward atonement is to heal the rift from the other side as well. So for me, the idea of being who I am now and re-entering that society that I had harmed and that I had sort of broken ties with is sort of the final step out into the change that I've been working on for all those years.
Do you wish you could meet with the families?
Absolutely.
And do you wish you could meet with the DA?
Absolutely.
And do you wish you could meet with the governor?
More so than ever, yes. I think it would be great.
Yeah.
I listened to his State of the State address.
Yeah. But there is, I mean, the whole reconciliation movement hasn't come into effect people here?
No, it's not really a part of what, I think that the prison has been pretty insulated from encouraging that. So we've always done it by virtue of, you know, sort of creative forms rather than one-on-one. And I think for me, I recognize, I mean, one of the things that would happen if I got out is that the victims would feel I have nothing to lose or gain, and it would make my apology a lot more believable. As long as I'm in, I understand that they're saying, does she really care or is she just trying to get out? But I'll never stop saying that I am available to anyone that was harmed by my crime and would keep it private and not use it to my own advantage, but to be able to say what I feel like I owe them to say and will always owe them to say, which is how sorry I am for having harmed and changed their lives in terrible ways.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.